It's now my great pleasure to hand the floor to Emma and this panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Really interesting to see the responses to the bottom survey question where people talked about the word sustainability and telling a more transparent story and a more positive story about cotton. Well, good morning to the first session of today, and it's always a tough gig to follow the ICA Welcome Party, so thank you all for turning up. And there's nothing like a discussion on legislation and public policy to get the blood flowing after an event like last night. So this session is a result of the ICA recognising that there's a lot happening down the supply chain that we're unaware of, and the immediate past president, Tim North, established the Retailers Working Group, and the ICA has also signed an MOU with the Textile Genesis platform in order to get a closer understanding of what the challenges in demand for data will be and what the impact is going to have on our supply chain. And I think we can all say we're very familiar with the origin information, but we're less familiar with what retailers and brands are having to face. So legislation of any sort can be very boring and complex and confusing. And trust me when I say the time it took to navigate the EU legislation in preparation for this event, you practically need a degree in acronyms or jargonology to be able to work it out. So hence, by its very nature, this kind of legislation, it's easy to ignore and until it impacts us and we wonder, where the hell did this come from? So we've all been mapped in the supply chain at this stage. We're all assigned a tier, and we currently have a part to play in collecting and disseminating information. But that may be ramping up with the pending legislation. So before we get into the delightful world of public policy, there are other aspects that are informing our opinion of why traceable supply chains are important. Consumers themselves are becoming aware and becoming more educated on the impact of the global fashion industry, which has an estimated value of $2.5 trillion. And it's rightly or wrongly accused of being responsible for more greenhouse gas emissions than the maritime and the air transport sectors combined. Workers' welfare is being focused on, as is the waste produced by the sector. Last year, Bain and Company a study revealed that 15% of global fashion consumers are concerned about its impact, and that could increase to 50% in the very near future. And back in 2019, McKinsey & Co. surveyed apparel company executives and found that they increasingly believe sustainable sourcing is vital for their businesses to succeed. They ranked sustainable materials, traceability and transparency, and supplier relationships as the top 3 on their list of priorities for the next 5 years. So that's up to 2024. Simultaneously, both the European Union and the US are working on directives and draft legislation that have real impact on brands and retailers. And some of these policies are geopolitical in nature and relate to the origin of fibers. Others are more focused on the sustainability practices and the claims that brands and retailers make. They're driven by governments trying to enforce clean, green, socially equitable supply chains with a heavy reliance on science-based targets, reporting and penalties for non-conforming. We've previously looked at traceability from the farm through to the spinning mill, but today we want to take a look at the other side of the supply chain, the brand and retailer through to the spinning mill and merchant, and see what brands and retailers are prioritizing and why. And we're very fortunate to have a stellar panel of experts to address this issue and provide some insight to this changing landscape. And I'll introduce the panel before we begin the discussion. Jennifer Spoljaric joins us from Seattle. She's online. She represents the iconic brand of Tommy Bahama, and congratulations to Tommy Bahama. They celebrate their 30th anniversary this year. It's an American-based, island-inspired lifestyle brand, and they use 80% cotton in their products. Tommy Bahama retails in North America, Australia, and New Zealand, and they sell online globally. And I have to say, doing the research on this company made me desperately want a holiday on an island somewhere. Jennifer Spoljaric is the Executive Vice President of Supply Chain for Sustainability. She manages sourcing and she oversees production, planning, inventory management, sustainability and compliance, and she's been with Tommy Bahama for 23 years. Next we have John Hopper from VF Corporation. Luckily, John has only a short walk to get here today. His office is down the road. VF Corporation started out in Pennsylvania in 1899 as the Reading Glove and Mitten Manufacturing Company. Not much call for mittens these days. In the 60s, they entered the denim space and purchased the Lee brand, and in the 80s, they bought Wrangler and other denim brands, and they moved their headquarters to Cotton Country in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1998. And from 2000 on, they embarked on a series of brand purchases in the active lifestyle space. They're now the world's leading portfolio in active lifestyle brands, including North Face, Timberland, Kipling, Icebreaker, to name a few. John is a 30-plus year veteran of the footwear apparel industry supply chain. He's held numerous leadership management positions within the leather, chemical, footwear, and apparel industries. As Senior Director of Global Materials Supply, John is part of a team that manages VF Corporation's $2.5 billion annual material procurement. Thank you for joining us, John. Next, to help us decipher some public policy is Lisa Ventura, serving as the Public Affairs Manager at Better Cotton, formerly known as BCI, the world's foremost cotton sustainability initiative. Lisa advocates for sustainable agricultural practice and a just transition. And Lisa's experience includes over 8 years at the World Economic Forum, where she managed public-private partnerships to achieve greater social impact. Welcome, Lisa, and thank you for coming down from Kuala Lumpur for this event. Well known to this audience is Tazamul Haq from Square Textiles in Bangladesh. Tazamul started his career in the textile manufacturing business in 2001, and over the last 22 years, he's worked on planning, business development, and sourcing functions at Square Textiles in Bangladesh. And Square Textiles and its sister concerns are engaged in manufacturing and exporting of yarns, fabrics, and ready-made garments. He's currently the operations director at Square Textiles, and suffice to say, there's not much that Tazamul doesn't know about the spinning and textile industry. And last but not least, Bill Ballandy needs little introduction, but I'll do it anyway for the benefit of the next generation in the audience. Bill joined the cotton business in 1996 as a trainee at Raleigh Brothers & Coney in Liverpool. He moved in 2001 to join the SEAM to manage their international cotton trading platform. In 2007, Bill joined Louis Dreyfus Company as a trader in Geneva, and he's managed LDC's cotton businesses in India, China, European and Black Sea regions, and Australia. And at the end of 2017, Bill left LDC to start his own business called Dragon Tree, focusing on online auctions for cotton, which he exited last year. Bill is currently the head of sustainability and innovation for cotton back at LDC. Thanks for joining us, Bill. Now, before we begin our discussion, I'd like to set the scene in relation to what's happening in the policy space. You'll see from the slide there are a number of legislative directives being proposed both in the European Union and in the US, and other countries are expected to follow suit. In the European Union, under the new Green Deal, the Green Claims Directive was established on March 22nd. And the European Commission published its proposal for the Green Claims Directive. The proposed directive sets out new minimum norms for how companies substantiate, communicate, and verify their environmental claims to consumers in the European Union. It also contains measures to control the increasing number of environmental labels. It covers all products sold in the European Union, regardless of the domicility of the brand owner or the retailer. So you could be a retailer in Singapore selling products to the European Union, and you need to be compliant under this proposed legislation. The next one is the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. The aim of this is to foster sustainable and responsible corporate behavior and to anchor human rights and environmental consideration in companies' operations and corporate governance. So it's directly dictating how people operate in those spaces. And the new rules will ensure that businesses address the adverse impacts of their actions, including those in their value chain inside and outside Europe. So you can see that it has a very, very long reach in this directive. Once these directives become law, it's estimated that member states will get about 18 months to make them national legislation. So this implies at the end of 25 or early 26, we're looking to have national legislation covering all of these aspects. In the US, the FABRIC Act, the Fashion Accountability and Building Real Institutional Change, is a federal act, and the key provisions are to create world-leading worker protections in apparel production. It also amends the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 to include National Garment Industry Registry, accountability for wage violations, and instead of the piece rates, setting an hourly rate for garment workers. There are support programs to implement the changes, and there are tax incentives for reshoring manufacturing back to the US. The Fashion Act, the Fashion Sustainability and Social Accountability, is a New York State proposal. And fundamentally, the Fashion Act ensures a fair correlation between the economic power of multinationals and their legal responsibility. Mandatory due diligence is the means of enforcement. And then the other Trade Act is concerned with workers' rights in other country and origins. So in order to help us understand this legislation a little bit more, we'll start with Lisa. It's a very tricky policy space to navigate for the average person. And you were recently quoted in the Fibre to Fashion article calling for clarity on the EU's Green Claims Directive. I gave a brief introduction, but can you talk a little bit about what that means and what it means around impact data for the audience?
Yes, thank you, Ima, and thank you so much for the ICA to put this topic at the forefront of its agenda. So yes, I call for more alignment as well as coherence when you see all those policies, because the aim of those policies is first to have a clear level playing field for all actors to have the same impact and be kind of judged at the same price, if I may say, but also, of course, to combat climate change. And the reason why I feel it's so disjointed right now is that it looks at three distinct policy areas. So you have everything related to trade and customs, then you have everything related to more productions, due diligence, and so on. And thirdly, everything related to consumption. So how do you communicate about your claims? This was the specific law I commented on. And of course, how do you label products and how do you process your waste? So you have those three kind of bodies trying to, I would say, achieve the same goal, but are not looking at the same life cycle of any raw material. So how do you conciliate all of that? So I think that's one of the challenges. The second one, I see it a bit of a race to the top from different nations, especially from the global north, trying to really enhance their leadership in achieving those sustainable goals and fighting climate change, of course. But the issue there, they don't communicate enough, whether it's the EU, specific member states, or other countries like in the US, Australia, and other countries around the world. They don't necessarily compare, and it's more about, okay, no, I need to be the first one there. And then looking at impact data, I'm really glad you asked that, because how I see it today, there's a strong risk of having an unintended consequence on cotton and really favoring synthetic fibers. And I think for you as the ICA community, this is something that you really need to understand and to act upon. Because if laws are going to favor synthetic fibers, and again, I don't think they want to, it's more because of different ways of measuring the impact, they don't understand how cotton is complex. So if you compare cotton to a synthetic fiber, they will look at one set of the production up to the consumer, and that's it. But for example, if they're not going to look at how, let's say, a cotton made out of t-shirt will have such a longer life, it's going to be easier to recycle, it's such a more complex story. So I think
that's the product environmental footprint, isn't it?
Exactly.
The PEF, another acronym that you're going to get used to hearing, the PEF and the LCA. So.
Exactly. So I think what I'm trying to say here is really that we need to make sure that there's a strong demand for sustainable cotton, and for that we need to tell that story, as Joe Nicosia very eloquently said yesterday, not just to consumer, but also to lawmakers.
Yeah, true. And just a point on that, Better Cotton has now introduced a traceability option. Is that in direct response to what brands and retailers are calling for in order to trace their supply chain?
I mean, I think it's the entire ecosystem, right? I think, of course, the brands have a great role in that. I think the investors as well are really key players in that, the consumer, and also just the idea that we need to de-risk the supply chain and make it more transparent for the benefits of all.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you.
Jennifer, you can hear us?
Yes.
Great. Thank you for joining online. I think it's just after 7 p.m. in Seattle. When we spoke in the lead up to the conference, you told me that like many retailers, Tommy Bahama has incorporated traceability into its sourcing. Can you explain what the key driver of that change was and how important traceability has become to your business?
Yes. Hi. Yeah, thank you. Number one, we want to reduce our impact, right? So we want to be able to have an understanding of where our materials come from. Another thing in the US is that the FTC has something called the Truth in Claims rule, and they've been enforcing this rule, and they've been actually fining brands that cannot substantiate specific marketing claims. So for example, the FTC sued Kohl's and Walmart for falsely marketing rayon textiles as bamboo that was made using eco-friendly processes, while in reality it wasn't. There are regulations like that that are coming that have become important drivers for us to be able to trace our fibers. We trace a variety of what we call preferred fibers. It would be, things such as Tencel lyocell, Supima, Pima. There's quite a few of our products that we have to get either scope certificates or transaction certificates so we can back up our claims if we're going to have any kind of marketing. Those are just some of the examples. As you had mentioned, the Fashion Act is coming, so we're trying to prepare for the Fashion Act. As well as the UFLPA has also driven a lot of impetus for us to have to trace.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. And I read with interest on your website where Tommy Bahama is going to reduce the environmental and social impacts of the products by managing things like, plastic packaging and metals and recyclable material for labeling, etc. But what caught my attention was the target for sourcing 100% cotton from preferred sources by 2030, compared with recycled polyester by 2025 and cellulosic fiber by 2025. So there's a 5-year difference in sourcing cotton. Does that relate to how difficult the cotton supply chain is to navigate versus the other fibers?
Absolutely, and it also goes to show that a lot of brands are confused of who they align with or who they get their information from. There's so many different organizations that are out there that you can join. Either it's a mix of BCI, is it Cotton Trust Protocol, are you doing traceable cotton? It's definitely a lot more complex, and then there's a lot of different platforms out there. Brands are confused of which ones to choose.
Yeah, it is a very complex space, and unfortunately we only have 1 hour to discuss this today, so it is really a high-level discussion of something that we probably need to spend a little bit more time on later. John, when I talked about that survey that was conducted by McKinsey, it was related to the 3 most important topics for apparel company executives. Would you agree with the statement that sustainable materials, transparency and traceability and supplier relationships are key to the success of a business today?
Yeah, absolutely. I think any successful strategy has to build in traceability and transparency expectations in the supply chain. With the legislation coming in that you've mentioned, those requirements are, the bar is being lifted even higher. It's moving from something we would like to do to something that we must do, and it's absolutely essential that that's part of the strategy across all materials, frankly, but particularly, I think particularly natural fibers, where the expectation is that you go right back to the origin, and I think that's one of the big differences between the expectations that are set upon natural fibers relative to synthetics. with synthetic fibres, the expectation is you don't have to go so far and so deep into the supply chain, where with natural fibres, we are expected now to be able to trace back to the primary producer.
Yeah, and I think that's very clearly an uneven playing field when you look at, where man-made fibre comes from. If it's only going to the factory, then you're not looking at the fossil fuel implications of it being a byproduct of that. And I think that's one thing that industry conversations are looking at, that measure, and is it fair and is it equitable? So there's a lot of conversation happening in that space that we'll have to delve more into. John, in September, VF Corporation was named in Fortune 2023 on the Change the World list. I haven't actually looked at who else is on that list, but it's pretty impressive. And that was for your work on the regenerative rubber supply system. So you're obviously quite forward in your work on tracing sustainable supply chains. How does cotton compare? So like similar to what Jennifer said, it's harder to trace cotton. Do you find that as well, comparing it to the other products?
Honestly, I don't think I think all of the fibres, all natural fibres, face similar challenges because the expectation is that you go back to the primary producer. So in that respect, I think I don't see any more complexity in cotton relative to other natural fibres. Certainly, it's more challenging than, as I said, than synthetics. But it is, I think cotton as a supply chain has, in some ways has an advantage over some other fibres because it has such a well-developed trading and commodity-based infrastructure sitting alongside the primary and behind the primary producers. That's a foundation that should allow us to build the required traceability and transparency models, potentially more easily than some other commodities.
Okay, and do you see associations like the ICA playing a part in that, information sharing and connecting?
Yeah, absolutely. I think as we move forward, I think we will increasingly see requirements around transparency and traceability being asked to be included in contracts of sale, and in that respect, the ICA will absolutely be a front and centre of that process.
Yeah, and that also speaks to the ICA reviewing, how much of the supply chain we actually talk to, and obviously we have to evolve that conversation. Tasmal, in your business, you've got the benefit of a vertical integration, but not every spinning mill has that, and not every garment manufacturer backwardizes to spinning. That's a vulnerable section of the supply chain. Can you talk about how you've managed that traceability and the challenges that's that's raised for your business?
First, thanks to ICA to include this this issue. This is very every day we are facing with these things because retailers are very much aware, and we find them that they are adhering to these rules and these acts, and they are passing on the requirements to us as a manufacturer. And what we find that not all the requirements are similar. Different brands are trying to figure it out in different ways. So as a manufacturer, in our position in this value chain, we find that these requirements are not uniform, and some of the requirements are very much expensive and some are quite difficult, such an extent sometimes impractical. When we pass it to to cotton merchants, traders, ginners, up to farm level. So, and each of the actors in this supply chain has a very different level of awareness, consciousness to these rules. What I believe, or I understand, this will be a new normal thing for us. We cannot just ignore it. And to be a new normal, this whole procedure needs to be sustainable itself. All the actors, we need to have a clear understanding on our obligations and also our cost burdens.
Yeah. And that's really not the case at the moment, is it? I mean,
That's not really the case at the moment, but for that we need to have an inclusive dialogues. And for this also, that's why I thanked ICA to at least to have a forum and discussions to open up some dialogues.
yeah. Yeah, and I think obviously this is the first time we've had retailers address the ICA, and I think it's fair to say that up until the last couple of weeks, retailers did not have an awareness of what the ICA even was or what its function was. So it's good that we have this introduction. Bill, it's fair to say that given your role as head of sustainability for cotton at LDC, that LDC takes this issue very, very seriously. And not to give away any secrets, but what can merchants do in this space to facilitate it? I mean, we get data from the grower and the ginner, and we pass information to the spinning mill. How do we prepare ourselves for the demands for new data coming at us?
Well, I think the first thing the merchant community has to do is to make sure the role of the merchant is understood downstream. In that, I think recently many retailers and brands have only become aware of the merchant's role in the supply chain and what we do. I think they sometimes have confused us with a broker, for instance, whereas we're an integral part of the supply chain. And what we do is aggregate, manage risk, manage the logistics, and effectively manage that whole supply chain. So we're a very good lens to look all the way upstream through to the grower, because to go direct to the grower is absolutely an option and should not be excluded, but then you have to do all your own aggregation, your own supply chain management, and that's quite a job. So I think when it comes to legislators, they have to be quite careful here, because the supply chain is organized in a certain way. And what we hear and what we've heard today is that impact and provenance are already being legislated for, and rightly so. Impact and provenance can be delivered through the supply chain from the merchant community, and at LDC we're doing exactly that. So we have programs where we deliver impact and where we can guarantee provenance. But if you want both at the same time, then you are looking into a supply chain reorganization, and that comes at a different price point. And many brands and retailers will be willing to pay that in order to make on-product claims and to have impact and provenance in the same basket, if you like, to be able to say, well, this t-shirt or this shirt is made from that cotton which had this impact and it's got this provenance.
Yeah.
That comes at a cost. And so I think legislators have to involve the whole value chain in this conversation, so they are careful to legislate in a way that allows the supply chain to operate in the way they see fit. Some people will be prepared to pay for impact and provenance together, but many people might want it in a mass balance, where the impact is still being delivered and the provenance is still being guarded for. So what you do not want in the supply chain is not there, but not necessarily in the same product at the same time. And so mass balance, I think, has a real role to play. And I'm sure at Better Cotton you have this debate the whole time. But that's, as a merchant community, I think we need to be involved in the conversation with legislators, and so do growers. They need to be involved in the conversation.
So, again, an unintended consequence could be retailers and brands can go directly to growers if they choose to manage that supply chain.
Absolutely.
The downside of that is it reduces the arbitrage ability for that product. So it could have an unintended consequence. And I honestly don't see that as a huge shift in our supply chain. But there's a potential for that to happen. If we don't understand what we need to pass on as information, and retailers have to comply with this legislation, if they can jump through supply chains to get what they need, there's a potential that merchants' arbitrage ability is reduced.
Well, exactly. I mean, you don't want to buy an electric car if you can't charge it, if there's no infrastructure. There are certain countries where you buy an electric car and it would just sit in the garage because there's no infrastructure. the merchant community represents that infrastructure. We are there to provide a service, and I think it needs to be understood how the journey of impact and provenance can flow through that, and whether it happens together on a truly traceable way, or separately, still having the desired effect, but on a mass balance way. And I think the two will both have a good future.
I think you touched on the point of cost, and I think that's probably the elephant in the room when we talk about traceability and sustainability. It's very hard to quantify what that would be, but I mean, similar to Joe's comment yesterday about who pays for the carry cost. When we talk to Jennifer and John about this, currently they're probably absorbing those costs because of their need to comply with legislation, but going forward, how do you see that cost being disseminated back through the supply chain? Or is the consumer going to pay for this green sustainability, traceability option? Jennifer, do you want to?
As you had mentioned, we right now are not passing on the costs to the consumer unless one of the mills is in particular charging us a little bit more for whatever that preferred fiber is. Then it does get bundled into the cost of the garment, and then ultimately, yes, the consumer would be paying more.
John?
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole industry recognises there's going to be some additional cost, but I think the solution to that is collectively as an industry, everybody from consumers backwards, accepting that they have a role to play in accepting some of that cost, and from the production side of the industry, and when I say production, I mean from farmers through to retailers. I think we need to switch the lens that we look at that. So I think we need to be thinking about these less in the terms of what is it going to cost me to comply, and more in terms of what will the cost of my business be if I do not comply. And increasingly we will find that the cost to our business of non-compliance are magnitudely larger than the cost of compliance. And ultimately, as brands and retailers, we will need to comply. And for the broader industry, if the choice is we're not going to invest, we're not going to accept those costs, those industries will be marginalised when it comes to the choice of fibre we use. So I think there is cost. It's the competitive nature of the industry means that cost can't necessarily be fully passed through to the end consumer. It will need to be absorbed at each stage. A portion of it will be taken at each stage of the supply chain, but we need to be thinking about it of what's the negative impact on our business if we don't do this, because that is going to be far greater than the cost of actually doing it.
And I suppose in how we look at that in terms of merchandising a commodity and what spinning mills produce, the term market access comes to mind. So without providing the information that's required, brands and retailers will go to, well, what's the easiest option to comply with my legislative requirements? So the unintended consequences is that cotton might lose some market access in that space. And we're already facing, such competition with man-made fibre. We need to be able to, find the opportunity with this and the question to the panel, it's a challenge, but does it also provide an opportunity to tell a really good news story about cotton? Because it's not going to go away, is it?
I would really hope so. I do think we have a little bit of an issue, and we've talked about that actually at this conference a lot with regard to the narrative we deliver around cotton. John said it's a little bit harder for retailers have to go all the way back to the grower. So I think through this messaging around impact, we could find the good news story that we've been looking for cotton in order to defend it as we lose market share, which we are doing year on year on year. And as global fiber consumption in the world goes up year on year on year, cotton is losing market share. And we have a natural fiber, but that natural story needs to be told. And perhaps through this impact, that's a way to tell the story.
Yeah, and I know that through the ICAC, so the body that feeds information back to cotton-producing countries, the information that's been provided to the plenary this year is really around that space of traceability and sustainability because of the way that it's perceived to be measured, particularly in Europe. So if that's not understood, the unintended consequences could be that cotton is completely blocked out of the European Union if our measure for what is sustainable is not really clear. So, I mean, obviously that legislation's not coming into play till the end of next year or early 26, but that's not a lot of time, is it? You know, have we had enough industry consultation in this space? Lisa, what do you think?
I mean, I would say not yet. I think the retailer and brands have been talking to lawmakers a bit more because I think they see the threat and I think the risks, the loss, potential loss, much closer. I think the rest of the cotton trade is maybe not seeing it as their issue yet, and I think that's maybe something that you as the ICA community need to rethink because this is coming, this will impact you, and there's a unique, I think, opportunity to share just how is cotton, and that will allow maybe not necessarily more flexibility because it might not be there, but maybe more, I don't know, financial assistance, for example, or just for those metrics to understand they can't compare, you know, synthetic and natural fibers. And to go back to your point, Bill, on the cotton story, I think one thing that we often forget is, yes, cotton is a more sustainable choice and a fantastic crop, but it's also a lifeline for millions. And I think that's something, such a powerful story that we sometimes forget. And I think for me, that would be the narrative we need to hone in as a sector.
Yeah, and certainly, particularly when we look at the social impact of change in that supply chain, it's really critical that we don't disadvantage cotton-producing nations as a result of a measure. Yeah. Tasma, there are so many platforms, and I guess this is for spinner and retailer on the panel, there are so many platforms to choose from. You've got to comply with legislation and demand for data. How do you choose? So sorry, I'll go back. There are platforms for traceability, and then there are third-party verifications required to independently verify that that data is correct. How do you navigate that space? Like, how do you make that decision on who to use?
These are mostly customer-driven. The buyers or retailers who we are working with, we have to adhere to their rules and regulations. And this process of choosing, it's relied on what business we are taking, with whom we are doing business with. And on the earlier question, it's definitely an opportunity for cotton also, because if you go beyond the letters of the act, if you go to the spirit of the act, that for the sustainability of the world issue, then obviously cotton has a story, and so it's an opportunity also. I think it's an opportunity for us, the whole community.
Okay, retailers, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a question we're all still grappling with because there are many platforms out there. I think the view that we have is from a solution point of view, I think that solution needs to come from the industry. Right? I think there is, so that we end up with all of the platforms are effectively looking at the same data set. So if we think about that data set agnostic to the platform, and as an industry, we think about how do we ensure that that data set is delivered with every bale of cotton, then it really doesn't matter. Like, then you break down this need, you know, is it 10 Teragenesis? Is it BCI? Is it whatever, right? Whoever it is that's out there. So I think making the data set available, agnostic to the platform, because the data that we want is exactly the same data. And I think also thinking about it, I think we can overthink the complexity of it. That's not to say it's easy. I think the challenge is more around the volume of the data rather than the data itself. Because the data that's being asked for, when you break it down to its simplest components, is who did you buy your product from? Who did you sell your product to? And can you connect those two transactions? And in a commercial world, we connect those two transactions because there's a purchase order that comes in on one end and there's an invoice that goes out on the other end. And if you break it down into those simplistic components, the data we're asking for, particularly around provenance, is not that complicated. There's just huge volumes of it. And so it's how do you manage the volume rather than the complexity of the data itself. When it comes to impact, it's a little bit more complicated, and then you're talking of things around soil health and potential carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas emissions. That data set is more complex to get at, but from a provenance point of view, it's very, very basic, simple data, but just literally truckloads of it. Right?
Jennifer, I think when we spoke prior to this session, you talked about, well, I think we mentioned blockchain and using data like that, but it's even down to paperwork, because that's really what retailers are using at the moment in a lot of cases. Is that your experience?
Even though we've aligned with a platform, and it is complex to choose which platform to use, and I'm sure it's incredibly frustrating for our whole supply chain because all the brands are using different platforms. And we are requiring a lot of data in there, but then I would say sometimes things don't come through in English, right? I mean, it's a small supplier, and we now have to have somebody be able to interpret the different documentation for us, and then we need somebody to verify the documentation for us. I mean, it's complex. Even though we have a system to put it all in, now it requires people to audit, follow up, chase.
Of course, it's a complex supply chain, and a lot of countries, blockchain would not necessarily work either, you know.
I have a point of view there that I don't necessarily agree with that. There's very, very few countries in the world that you go to today where even the smallest primary producer doesn't have a mobile phone. And mobile-enabled technologies will allow us to collect and transmit the data sets that we need in a very low cost and a very efficient way. The blockchain doesn't, you know, individual farmers don't need to be worried about the blockchain. The blockchain is just a ledger that sits in the cloud somewhere, right? So mobile data technologies exist. They allow you to collect the huge volumes of data that you need at very low cost. And thinking about the process in that way, I think will allow us to get at that. Blockchain becomes important because it becomes an immutable record, right? You know, I think everybody in this room is well aware of the challenges the cotton industry in particular has around the veracity of some of the information that is put into the supply chain.
Correct.
The blockchain doesn't necessarily address that veracity, but it makes it harder to edit the information once it's put into the system.
I agree with that, with one caveat, which is that, first of all, data at a producer level is often protected by Privacy Act. So although it is there, it's not necessary it can be or will be shared, at least in the near future. So that perhaps not utopia, but that ideal scenario may take some time. There are privacy laws, there are reasons around it. And then, but what I think you've touched on, John, that's very important is the veracity of that data. And I think that comes down to trust, by definition. And I think what we've seen, say, in the organic space is a loss of confidence in much of that data, because the data has been separated from the physical flow of the cotton, and often that data is questionable. Going back to the role of, say, the merchant in this, one of the roles we play in the supply chain is to be a trusted partner, is to be somebody that is always there to buy, is always there to sell, and is trying their best to be a trusted partner. And so I think having that trust in the supply chain is also very important, because we all know there are people you can trust and there are people you can't. When it comes to that data, until there is an immutable record of it, I think trust will be everything.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that was one of the key points of that McKinsey study, wasn't it? Supplier relationships and trust. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in the absence of any harmonized system from any country, because we're not there yet with that level of data, I think that the role that the ICA can play in that is, you know, we do have a very robust contract system. We do have, you know, adherence to contract sanctity. It's really important. So at least we have that in the space that we can build on then. And I don't think we're not here to purport answers to these problems. It's really about raising this issue for awareness and trying to work out what are the next steps that we can do to avoid unintended consequences to more demand destruction for cotton.
Well, perhaps the ICA, I don't know, could play a role in terms of ensuring that that legislative debate, or the legislation that's going through right now, does filter through the whole supply chain and doesn't get executed in a way that is unenforceable by the supply chain, which I would hope wouldn't happen anyway. But if it exists in a sort of bubble at tier 1 and 2 and doesn't happen in tier 3, 4, 5, whatever you call us,
Yeah.
I think, you know, all the way down to the producer level, then there is a risk that,
Yeah.
that
18 months is not a long time, is it?
It's not. It's not.
Yeah. Jennifer, did you have anything else to add on that as far as systems or verification of data? Obviously, it's a new space for new businesses as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say, again, you know, brands, we're working so far in advance. I mean, we're starting on 2026. So we're anticipating and looking at these laws and regulations that are coming. And as we're choosing our fabrics and materials, we know we need to be prepared for what's going to happen in 2025 and 2026. And I just want to just kind of stress that to everybody at the event who's at a different time frame and maybe thinking it's longer out, and it's really not.
Yeah, thank you. It is imminent. I think if we had this conversation 3 years ago, the impact wouldn't have been as vital as it is today. We don't have a lot of time left, and we do want to open to questions, but John and I had a conversation last week about the evolution of this supply chain, and I think it was a really interesting comment that you made about the origins of the VF Corp. Do you want to share that, John?
Yeah, I think it was, we were talking about the fact that VF Corp is 130 plus years old through its various incarnations. And I'm old, but I'm not quite that old, so I wasn't actually there. But my guess is that 100 years ago, 50 years ago, the people that sat in my role in procurement at VF probably were on first name terms with certainly their spinning mills, their fabric mills, and probably the cotton grower, because he was just in another part of the Carolinas. As we look forward, not another 100 years, I think another 3, 5 years, we're probably moving in the direction where that will go back, will go full circle, and brands will be directly connected to, and when I say directly connected to, I think in terms of knowledge of who they are, not necessarily from a commercial point of view, but we will know, and we will need to know who our primary producers are, who those growers are, we will have a very close connection with certain members of that community. That already, within our supply chain, that already exists in our merino wool supply chain. The president of Icebreaker, which is one of VF's brands, which merino wool is their primary fibre, is on first name terms with a number of our farmers in New Zealand. Whenever he's in New Zealand, he stays at their property, has dinner with them, gets invited to the kids' weddings. That's the level of relationship we have, and I think we'll start to get back to that closeness where the whole supply chain is much better interconnected than it has been in the past. It will become much more strategic and much less tactical than we've seen in the last 25 years.
And that doesn't mean that reshoring, nearshoring, or onshoring is going to happen in any way, shape, or form, but the ability to connect and provide that data and have that relationship with the existing producers is probably what's going to become more critical. All right, in the interests of time, please scan your questions, or scan the code and ask some questions, please. But as we're wrapping up, it is important to say that ICA is certainly aware of what's happening in this space, and we're trying to become closer to that information and share it with the members. And if there are other aspects of this conversation you'd like to have, please let us know. First question, is the increased rate of textile recycling a threat or an opportunity for the cotton industry? Who'd like to take that?
I'll have a go.
Yeah.
And John, or Jennifer, you'll probably pick me up on this, but I think most recycling in the textile space is not cotton today. It's mostly aimed at man-made fiber. Most of the brand mandates around, many of whom have a 2030 vision, will consider recycling to be more of a man-made fiber strategy than a cotton strategy. And I think cotton has many challenges when it comes to recycling. But pretty much every spinning mill you visit nowadays has some kind of cotton recycling strategy as well. So I don't think it's such a big threat at the moment. I do think it could be an opportunity, because part of the good news story could be that it's not only biodegradable, but it's also recyclable.
Yeah.
But I think recycling is more of a man-made strategy.
So it's part of the solution, realistically.
I think there could be a little bit of threat there, but I think it could be part of the good news story we've been talking about.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's part of a fiber that is not recyclable has a very short future.
One of the questions which has disappeared now, it was a question of, if non-compliance, what is the direct impact of non-compliance for brands today? Jennifer, you touched on it earlier. Did you want to make a comment, John?
Yeah, I think we're seeing, it will depend on the legislation. In the EU, they're already, around packaging, they're already legislation coming in place. Extended producer responsibility legislation, EPR legislation, is going to basically transition the cost of processing waste at the end of the life cycle back to the person that sold the product or the brand that created the product. So it's a very significant cost.
In terms of financial
impact.
Fines.
Yes.
You're fined for non-compliance.
The act that's going through New York State at the moment, when that's fully enacted by 2027, if you're found to be in non-compliance, there is a fine up to 2% of your global revenue.
Wow.
That's a lot of money.
Terrifying.
Yeah.
2.5 trillion in the industry, so yeah. But it's a big...
And I think another one beyond the fine is also to actually retrieve all of your products from the markets. And that's one coming in the EU. And again, it's still being debated, so we don't know yet. but this is how far the thinking goes. It's like, oh, everything that has that specific, let's say, fiber that was not considered sustainable, it has to go away. So imagine if you have to reclaim all of your products across the entire market.
I think France, Germany, and Denmark might already have that legislation in place, or something similar to that. With the slowdown in demand, countries struggling with inflation and high interest rates, will the sustainability effort slow it down further? Good question. Bill, do you want to have a go at that?
That's a very good question, actually, and one I think is quite relevant today. I think high-cost sustainability will slow down. Joe said something yesterday on stage, which was that the role of the Fed is to try and slow down demand today and reduce inflation. And if you want to reduce inflation, then adding higher costs to the supply chain is not a very good way of doing that. So I do think today, where margins are under threat and where growth is trying to be destimulated and where inflation is very real, then it's not a great environment to launch a premium product, no matter how good. So you've really got to deliver on your impact and provenance story to capture that. But yeah, I think it's a real threat. Yeah.
Let's see, what else have we got here? Already asked that. Is current legislation covering traceability all the way to farm level, or is certificate of origin enough? We've relied on certificate of origins for so long. I think, Jennifer, that's not enough anymore. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I mean, certainly with the New York Fashion Act, that won't be, their requirements will be a lot more stringent. So it definitely won't be enough.
Yeah. Yeah, and the other question here is, which probably, I suppose, it comes back to what Sunny was talking about yesterday. This is an unnatural alliance. We're not actors in the supply chain almost directly connected all the time, but we can come together in order to prevent unintended consequences and share information in a more transparent way. The question was, the panel has brands, spinning mills, merchants, and better cotton. Will it be possible for all to come together to tell this sustainable cotton story? And I think that's probably a really good question for us to go away with, and how do we continue to foster this communication? Because I think we do know that we have an amazing product, but this legislation can prompt us to finding the best way to tell that story so that our impact data is positive and not negative. And just before we finish, does anybody have one particular thing that we could say to the audience that we could do around traceability solution? Is there one thing that stands out that we haven't addressed or that we could do better, that we haven't talked about today?
I mean, I would say to people all the way downstream, the brands and retailers, to jump in and start projects. Don't wait, because the real world experience of managing a traceable supply chain will pay you back so much over the coming years. As legislation comes, having that real world experience of, you know what happens if you try that, and you know what it costs if you want that.
Yeah.
I think it will be extremely valuable. So I would say brands and retailers should be, and many are, get involved, build projects, do it, don't talk about it.
Yeah.
I would agree that it's not just a nice to have, but it is becoming a requirement, so might as well not resist that change and just go full in. Yes.
Go with it.
Yeah, and for me, I think it's, as an industry, right, address those privacy issues, because that's the choice of the individual. As you know, so as an individual farmer, as an individual gin, as an individual spinner, get your head around the privacy concerns, address those privacy issues, allow that data set to be embedded with the bale, with the cone of yarn, because the cost of this traceability is massively more when we have to go back in to get the information than it is if the information is
Right.
passed to us with the purchase.
Yeah, good, great.
My take on the other question, that the threat, threat for the cotton, and when we are going for the traceability, when we go back to our supply chain to have the traceability, then the effort is charged and the cost becomes more. And whenever there is this requirement, everything is seemed to be more costly. But we, as all the supply chain actors, need to understand that we just cannot pass the cost. We have to make a solution in a way which is practically possible with a very little cost effort. And to find that solution which complies with the regulations, and also it's not so expensive, exorbitantly expensive, because otherwise it's really gonna discourage cotton spinning from us, cotton production to the grower. So it's a threat, but this threat might have pushed all of us together and create a new opportunity.
Yeah, and obviously we will, on the basic cost, polyester is, you know, twice as cheap as cotton today. So we know that the challenges are there and there's a cost implication, but there's a bigger cost implication if we don't get it right. And you know the term weaponizing data, maybe we could weaponize it for good if we actually get our story straight and be more transparent. And a lot of the times we keep data to ourselves because we think it's important, but it's more important to, you know, put it out there so brands don't have to go chasing it and choose another fiber as a result. Well, our time is well and truly up. Thank you all for your time today, and thank you to the panel. I think you've given us a lot to think about, and we're very appreciative of brands and retailers coming into this space and giving us some information about what will impact all of our businesses going forward. And I hope this is the first of many conversations. So thank you all for your time today, and thank you to the audience for listening. And if you want to follow up with any more requests for information through the ICA, it's something that we're interested in pursuing a course of discussion in this space. So thank you all.